food. They were stuck up in foxholes, and now snow is beginning to come down at this time of year, and they were eating primarily K rations and occasionally cold C rations. You couldn't build any fires or anything for obvious reasons. So we got a call, sent a call back to division headquarters and asked if there wasn't any way to get some hot food up to these fellows who were on the front line. So after much discussion, headquarters came back and said yes, they would load a truck up with plenty of hot food and send it up to us, and we would have one truck coming to the 1st battalion that we were in, and I guess the other 2 battalions also. And they said the truck would be leaving around just after dark, and would be coming up at dark. We should watch for it and wait for it, and we'd be well satisfied with what they had prepared for us. So after dark, everyone's all ready and waiting, and waiting, and waiting. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Got to be about 2 o'clock in the morning, and getting close to 3 o'clock, and maybe dawn was coming, and finally we heard a truck rumbling along, a typical GI 2.5-ton truck, half-ton truck. The only problem was, we were curious. The truck seemed to be coming from the German area in front of us instead of coming up from our rear. So we got all prepared just in case there was something strange going on. And there was. The truck arrived, and indeed it was an American truck, and indeed it was loaded with food, but all cold food. So the drivers explained what had happened. They started out properly. They thought they had the right direction to go, and they got lost. So after driving at night, trying to guess which road went to where and that sort of thing, one of the driver or his assistant commented, "You know what? Those fellows out there have different kind of helmets than we got." And they looked very carefully and said, "Yeah. And there's a big tank down there, and it's all painted in white, and it got a black cross on the side." Apparently these fellows in some way, well, they knew they were going past American lines, and when they got to the German lines, the Germans didn't stop them. And one of the reasons was the German army was very good at using captured American equipment, American tanks and anything else they could get. So seeing an American truck coming from toward their own front line and through just seemed like a normal truck. They were probably going back for more ammunition or something of that sort. So they never challenged them. The truck went on through, out back. The driver and his assistant, of course, immediately took their helmets off and tried to sit low and be as invisible as possible. No one ever challenged them or anything, and somewhere while they were back in the rear area, they latched onto a proper road. Of course, there are no signs. The signs are all twisted and turned, or none existed to begin with, but they did manage to find, like maybe look at the stars or the moon, I don't know, decided which direction to come, and they did get on back at last. The only time they got challenged was when they got back to the American lines, of course. Our guys, you know, what the heck are you doing out there in the front? And of course they had this story, and they sent them back to our area. Well, of course, the big punchline was the poor fellows got chewed out terribly for waiting so long, and so all the food got cold. And the second place, the officers, the military, they wanted to know why didn't they observe the numbers and types of all the tanks and how many men were there and all this kind of stuff. They were negligent in their duty, so the poor guys took a real beating. That's fun, episode 1. Anyway, we settled into Hatton, and this, we didn't know it at the time, but this was about the time the famous bulge began up north, where around Belgium. And I know we have a lot of guys around here that were involved in that thing, and they know what that was like. Well, I guess this, now you would call it, this is bulge south, the same type of activity. The Germans attacked, decided they wanted Hatton. It was a sort of a rail center too, and they started pouring all the heavy stuff they have, artillery, tanks, everything else, just plowed into the town, and eventually they finally leveled it. I wasn't in it at the time. But they moved in with heavy tanks. We had a few, our equipment consisted of some bazooka shells. We had somewhere we got a couple anti-tank guns, which didn't do much against the Tiger tanks, and the tanks themselves would roll down the street, and a couple of shots with them didn't do anything. Properly aimed bazooka, if it could hit the tank tread or the mechanism that the tanks rolled on, could damage them and possibly slow them down or stop them. But we didn't have much in the way of bazooka ammunition. We had the bazookas, but ran out of ammo. Then the next step was to try to put mines out in front of the tanks, and that could work for a while if the tank wasn't in sight while you were laying the mines. But you had to lay the mines. Normally, you'd try to dig a little shallow hole for them and cover them over, camouflage them. But the town itself had heavy blocks. The streets were all paved with heavy blocks. You couldn't dig holes in them, so you tried to lay them on the top. That didn't work because the German infantry would try to come around and clear the tanks as soon as the tanks saw them coming. And we tried to get the men that were doing that going into and coming up behind to clear the tanks, the German infantry, and you could shoot sometimes, you got them, but then they had so much firepower that, and we were greatly endangered. Then they finally cooked up another system of daisy chains of mines. Tie about 2 or 3 mines together with telephone wire that was all over the whole country, and pile up the mines in one side in a house in a doorway, and a brave man would get on the other side holding the other end of the wire, wait till the tank got up the street close enough that the driver could not look down over the front and see what was in front of them and keep coming. Then he pulled the string, the wire, pulled the string of mines out in front, and then run like heck out the back door. And usually that worked, because if the tank didn't see the mine, would run over it, and that could damage the treads too. Not always, but sometimes it stopped them. However, we ran out of mines too. We had no way of getting resupply with all the things that we needed. There were men with M1 rifles that were very carefully hoarding the last couple of clips, or maybe sharing them with someone else, but eventually we ran out of practically all ammunition. Machine guns were inoperable, and there was nothing much else to do, so we gradually withdrew back toward battalion headquarters. And across catty corner from the battalion headquarters, which was a military center, we had an aid station. Well, because of that very, very heavy casualties, we had probably several hundred men, Americans, that were wounded and injured in the aid station on both floors of the house, just laying like cordwood next to each other. We had 2 doctors, lieutenants, who were doing as much surgery as they could. We had lost a lot of the aid men, and they were just totally swamped for medical attention. Well, since I was out of everything that I had to fight with, and most of the other fellows were, the Major Lebron, decided that we could be more useful as medics. So he assigned us to the medical department verbally, and now we were medics. So we went in and attempted to help the medics out, putting on bandages and giving shots, tetanus shots and things of that sort. During the afternoon, the litter bearers brought in a German officer that had been shot, and I think in the leg. It wasn't a life-threatening injury, but he couldn't walk or anything. He came in on a litter, and the 2 men that brought him in just sort of dumped the litter right out in the snow, didn't pay any more attention to him. They went inside and went back to get somebody else. So after a while, this German officer, I don't know what his rank actually was, lieutenant, captain, who knows. I wasn't familiar with the German methods of identifying their top ranks. The fellow lay there very patiently. The snowflakes were beginning to fall in his face and on his body, and he patiently didn't say anything, nothing at all. So finally I decided this wasn't exactly humane. Maybe we should do something for him if possible. So I went over and checked to him, found out he could speak fairly good English, and I had some fairly good German. So between the 2 of us, we could communicate. So I checked his bandages, found out that it was apparently going to be satisfactory. I reset it and that sort of thing. And then I wanted to give him proper treatment, standard American way. Well, infantry were equipped with a little first aid package that included a compressed bandage. If you got shot, you took the bandage out of the pack and put it over the bullet hole and squeezed it down tight. And there was a little package of sulfa powder, which was the big antibiotic in those days. And also it included a little pack of 8 sulfa pills. And the theory was you poured the sulfa powder on the wound, put the compressed bandage on top of it, and then you took the 8 sulfa pills with a lot of water, supposedly, and that would act against the bacteria and any damage from inside, make you more or less immune to germs. That's what it said. So I had done everything else except give him the pills. So when I opened the pills out and I had them in my hand, and I told him, you know, open your mouth, you got to take these pills. Well, then he got a little apprehensive too. I got a feeling he thought these are pills that the Americans carry to kill German prisoners. You know, you just get them to eat one of them and that's the end, no more problems you have. And I kept insisting, no, this is a medication, this is for wounded, and all that stuff. And all he did was clench his teeth and roll his head one side to the other. He absolutely, when I tried to get him in his mouth, he'd keep his head, roll his head over and keep his teeth closed. I thought, this isn't doing any good. So finally I came with a remarkable conclusion. I held the pills out, all 8 of them, so he could see them. And I picked up one pill, held it up, popped it in my mouth, took a slurp of water from my canteen, and he looked at me and apparently I didn't drop dead. So then he realized maybe I really was serious about it. So then he nodded his head, okay. So then he opened his mouth and took the remaining 7 pills and drank out of my canteen and got all slurped up and that sort of thing. And then with another GI, we picked up his litter and carried it inside the house and set him down next to it was an appropriate place, next to where the 2 doctors were doing all the major surgery on the Americans that his people had shot up. So shortly after that, the tanks came up closer, and as I say, we couldn't get any kind of reinforcements. No other men could get in. There was apparently one little narrow way that the major got out, and nothing else could really come in. So finally, the Germans did come in. They rolled up, first of all, in one of the armored personnel carriers, which are weird-looking things with 2 wheels in the front like a truck, but 2 big tank treads in the back that took up a lot of space. And they rolled up first, and the tank, big Tiger tank came up the road just a little bit, turned the gun around, aimed it right at the aid station we were in, and I guess we're waiting to see how the other German infantry made out. Well, they did come in, checked the place out, and verified that indeed it was purely a medical aid station. And I guess they radioed back, and then the tank itself rolled up and stopped, parked right in front of the place. Well, they inspected the medical group that came over with the Germans, inspected all the men that were there, and all they could do was, this is war. Anyway, they took all the American GIs, like me, that could walk, out to the open field, the open area in the middle of the town. Most of the French towns, I guess a lot of the others, in the center of the town all have like a big open square, and in the middle is usually a water fountain of some type. And I guess, I don't know why, just a meeting type place, but it seems to be a standard construction. So they lined us up in the middle of the ground there, or parade ground, whatever you want to call it, near the fountain. And while we're there, they gave us a quick pat down. We didn't have any grenades or handguns or things like that. And while we're waiting there, while they're deciding what to do with us, incidentally, one of the things that we had heard long before is that tank troops do not like to take prisoners. After all, each tank needs its crew of 4 or 5, whatever it happens to be, and they can't afford to spare any personnel. So the rumors are that sometimes tank troops get rid of prisoners in a very easy and unfortunately noisy and permanent way. So we were apprehensive about all standing there. One German non-com apparently must have had some bad news from home or something, who knows what it was, but he was extremely angry and violent, shouting and screaming at us, walking up and down the in front of us and poking at everybody, stopping in front of people and poking a burp gun in their stomach and then walking down again. He got louder and louder. And we got more and more concerned about what would happen, especially when we noticed that all the German troops who were standing behind us suddenly decided to move aside, clear up, like they expected something maybe. Maybe this fellow had a reputation, I don't know. Fortunately, one of the German officers heard this tirade and walked over to him and had a little discussion with it. Couldn't hear what it was, but he suddenly stopped and gave a snappy salute to the officer, and he turned around and walked off, sounding like mumbling to himself. Well, it was getting rather late that time, and late in the afternoon, and they still hadn't found out what to do with us. So obviously there's no prison camps in a combat area like that, and they were interested in consolidating their position around the town, and yet they still had us to take care of. So they came up with a rather unique solution to the whole thing. Apparently, they decided to split us, the American POWs, with the German troops that were right now living in that town, and let them be our guards and take care of us while they were getting themselves reorganized. So about, maybe 8 or so Americans were checked off. It was my squad, and some of the other fellows were assigned to, would be I guess what we would call a section of maybe about 20 of the German troops. So they told us all to bunch together and get in column, and some of them were in front and the other half were in back of us, and they just marched us on out of the town, out on the outskirts of the town. And there was a barn outside, sort of by itself in a separate area. They marched us to the barn, opened the door, and got us inside. Then while we were standing there, they went up and checked around the inside of the barn, the second floor, the first floor, and that sort of thing, and decided we'd go up to the second floor. So some of the Germans went up first, and then we all went up the ladder, went through a hole in the floor, right up through a ladder, and the rest of the Germans, soldiers, came up behind us. We found out that the second floor was a good suggestion, good location, good idea. It had a lot of hay and straw all over the floor. It was also a little warmer than outside in the bitter cold that had developed. And also, it was at that time, a little bit of light coming through, and some of the Germans had very small flashlights that could light things up a little bit. And they grouped the Americans together on one side, and they all grouped on the other side. And there was the sergeant in charge. I assume he was a German sergeant. He seemed to have the rank that everybody respected. So he found a cot up there on the second floor somewhere, so he immediately commandeered it. That was by his virtue of rank. That was his place for the night. He pulled the cot over right next to the hole so he could keep an eye on us, and made himself comfortable, and the rest of us had made as comfortably as we could with the straw and the hay bales and things like that. One of the Americans, however, our fellows, had been shot in the leg. It wasn't a life-threatening condition either, and but he was injured. He had trouble walking. He could walk, but not too well. So in all due time, the German officer came up to check his troops to find out how we were all doing. I suppose he went to all the different locations there, and looked around and made some sort of a comment that, you know, this is the best place that we've all had to sleep in about the last 2 weeks. So they were pleased. Then he happened to notice the American who had been shot, so he went over and checked him and looked at the bandage and everything else. And then he did a surprising thing. He called to the German sergeant who was over at the bunk, made him get out of the bunk, and we put the injured American, on the cot, so that the sergeant had to sleep on the floor. Thought that was highly unusual too. I mean, a little touch of comparison. I think we figured out later on maybe that this one German officer that we had taken such good care of, made him take his sulfa medicine and that sort of stuff, apparently had passed the word around that, you know, these Americans really aren't savages after all. They're, you know, they're halfway decent almost, maybe slightly civilized. So maybe the word got around, because we didn't except for that one German that got all irritated, why, we didn't receive any rough treatment. Well, during the night, the artillery began ahead, hitting the town. I don't know whether it was American artillery or German artillery, or maybe both, but a real barrage was coming in, and it was hitting buildings, smashed the church steeple and a lot of the homes. It was just they just finally, as I saw pictures later on, they finally really destroyed the whole town of Hatton. It was one big pile of rubble. But while we were with the Germans in this barn, pieces of shell fragments were coming through the wall. The barn was only wood. Every now and then a little piece of the roof covering would fall down, and then splinters come off the side, and it wasn't a healthy place to be up on a second floor. However, the Americans sort of decided that we're going to tough it out with these other characters. So we made it a point not to jump, no matter how much a shell burst, how close it was, or how many splinters came through the thing. We sit there very coolly and calmly, like, you know, the old attitude. Do this all the time, you know, so what's the problem? And apparently the Germans were doing the same thing. They were looking at us, figuring if these Americans are so stupid or tough or something, that this doesn't bother them, we can't show them that we have any fear. So they're laying there rather coolly and chatting with each other and that sort of thing. And it was getting ridiculous. I mean, now the roof was, you could see the sky up through the top and that sort of thing. The German officer came back. I suppose he was checking up on all his troops, see how we're doing. He came up the ladder, got about halfway up, looked at the roof, looked at the walls, looked around here, and what he said in German, I'll never know. I can imagine the words that I would fill in about, you know, idiotic, stupid, idiotic, crazy, you name it, fill it in. Your words are as good as his. Anyway, that cleared everything up right away, and it was an order. Get down out of here. So I think about all 20 or 30 of us tried to get down that one ladder at the same time. And boy, we really tumbled all the way down to the bottom. Two of the Germans took care of the American that was wounded and very carefully lifted him down, not to hurt him. And not only did we stop on the ground floor, we found that there was a sort of a root cellar underneath it, all the way down to the bottom in there. Well, during the night, of course, we had to live together. And we began talking and chatting, and I could do a little bit of translation, and some of the Germans could speak rather good English too. And it became a sort of a half-friendly organization. They were talking about their interests, some of them, and I was talking about some of mine. We found out a lot of the Germans, all they wanted to do was go home and get to work on that car that they had that they left with standing up on blocks, or they wanted to get a motorcycle and start touring. Sound like mostly like Americans, the same sort of thing. They were looking through our packs, of course. They were curious about that. And we started sharing food. We gave them some of the cans from our K rations and showed them how our little twist can opener that would take the lids out. They thought they were real clever. And some of the rations had cheese, that sort of thing in. They, in turn, their standard ration, they carried like big chunks of bread and sausage in their kits. So they sliced all pieces of sausage and we could make sandwiches with it. And their canteens, instead of water, they had a rather light white wine in there, which was pretty good. So we shared things. By the time we got done, we were sort of almost buddies. Not quite. I mean, they were still the enemy, and they still had the duty to try to get rid of Americans, just like we did with them. So the next morning, when the sun finally, at early dawn, we all had to get up. They had to go back to duty, so they lined up made up a column from all the different Americans that were together. They finally came to a solution of what to do with this. They got us on a road that finally took us to a railroad and marched us in a group, column of something or other, and some of the German infantry in front and some in back, and we started off. Well, one of our men in the POWs had a serious heart condition, very serious, and he was supposed to have been discharged from the Army and sent home and that sort of stuff, but he was a very, very fascinating, interesting Irishman, and he refused. He begged the major not to send him home, to find something that he could do. So the major finally decided that he would become his Jeep driver. and let him be the Jeep driver. Well, you wouldn't have to walk or do anything more heavy than just drive a Jeep. But since this was now walking, he began to get chest pains, get tired, and really, really hurting. And of course, he couldn't walk as fast. He'd have to slow down periodically and stop and get his breath. And as a result, finally we wound up back at the end of this long column. I mean, I stayed with him, and a couple of the other fellows tried to help him. We tried to help him as much as possible. We carried his pack that he was able to salvage. And the guard who was running this column stopped and checked up, and we explained to him that this fellow has heart problem and that sort of thing. So they were compassionate enough to say, all right, well, you stay, one of you or two of you stay behind with him, help him along, and just stick with him. They sent a German guard back to walk behind us with the rifle, and of course we walked rather slowly, and the column got far ahead, way ahead, finally out of sight. We had no idea where it went, and there was only one other GI and myself and the one guard. So before the other column got completely out of sight, they decided to send the other GI that was with me up ahead to catch up to the column. They watched him to be sure that he got with them. And it was only the guard, me, and Dennis. Poor Dennis Long. Well, Dennis got slower and slower. Finally, the guard was helping practically to carry him, the guard on one side and me on the other side. And eventually, Dennis collapsed and fell to the ground. And we tried to see what we could do to help him. And the guard, recognizing that we weren't kidding, this was for real, he told me to stay with Dennis while he ran over to a nearby German unit and asked if they had a medic or something like that. So a German officer came over, and turned out he was the doctor for that particular group. And he knelt down, he had a little kit with him, and he worked on Dennis as much as he possibly could, everything that he could think of, I guess the equivalent of CPR and all that sort of thing. But unfortunately, Dennis died. So we had to carry Dennis over to the side, put him in one of the buildings there, and the German doctor assured us that, you know, he would do whatever he could to notify the Americans about it. Well, I took Dennis's I took his personal stuff out, his wallet, and his dog tags. I took one of the dog tags off in standard practice in the military and left the other one with him so they would know who Dennis was, and I had the information. Well, now I was in a little apprehensive situation too. Here I'm in the middle of a whole German group, all alone. Dennis is dead. The guard there has to go back to the unit that he was with, and I began to get a little wonder, you know, what's going to happen to me? Well, finally, they made another decision. A German officer came out in a Jeep and with the driver, and told me that to get in the front with him, and the other German GI got in the back. Of course, he had the gun right in back of me, so nothing else I could do. And he started out and drove toward. He said we catch up with our POW group column, and then I could rejoin them. Well, they had gone pretty far ahead. Our problems with Dennis had taken quite a long time. The convoy was quite a long distance ahead, and we were driving in what turned out to be a Volkswagen Jeep, which I was interested in. It was very fascinating machinery, and we were driving along a road by an open field, and suddenly the Jeep driver hit the brake hard and stopped immediately, jumped out of the Jeep. The lieutenant or the officer jumped out of the back seat, grabbed me by the arm, pulled me out, and shoved me down in a ditch. Well, the first thing I thought is, well, this is it. You know, what can I do about it? But then I found out that the German officer was on top of me in the same ditch with the driver. So he just points out up to the sky to an American plane that's patrolling and around there, and he says, we can't move. He said, if they see anything that moves, they shoot it. No matter what it is on the ground, he said, the Americans shoot everything. And he said, they don't care what they hit. If it's a train, if it's a locomotive, if it's an automobile, if it's a farm wagon, if it's a cow, or if it's a person or a dog, they shoot it. Anything that moves, they'll strafe. So stay here and don't move. So we just stayed there. And finally the plane floated away and out of sight, and we got back in the Jeep again and started off. This time they had 3 pairs of eyes. I was as alert as they were scanning the skies to see what I could see anywhere. And believe me, we finally caught up to the column, and I get in the column, and we went to a railhead. It wasn't a railhead, it was just a railroad. And they loaded us into the 40 and 8 boxcars there. This time the cars were all locked on the outside naturally. We were crowded in pretty well. And the train took off. Well, now it was still daylight, so they had observers on top, and they were watching to be sure that if any planes came at all, the train immediately stopped, preferably sometimes in a tunnel, anywhere where they hoped that it wouldn't be too visible, and they'd wait until the planes went away. In fact, at one place, actually, a plane did come down and strafed went over the whole train. There was about 4 or 5 cars with the machine guns on. One swipe, and then it went away. And the German commandant of the train was highly indignant about that, and he said, Americans will shoot anything, even POW trains. And they said, and we'll show you. So he took several of us out. We climbed up on top of the boxcars, and very clearly it has KG, KG on top of all the cars, which in German is POW, I think Kriegsgefangene, for clearly marked. So he said we decided he probably came down, opened up the guns first, and then saw the KG, but it was too late. So we already had, I don't know, half a dozen casualties who were killed in the strafing by an American plane on a German POW train. And they were probably the only things that could move. So he said they were going to, when they got to their destination, they would turn in a formal complaint to the Swiss Red Cross, who had representatives to be sure that the Geneva Convention was observed on both sides and all that sort of thing. Finally, the train arrived at a little town called Bad Orb. And I found out, of course, much later, I didn't know it then, but Bad Orb is one of the German resort places for the very wealthy people that want to go and drink fresh water and take special baths and, I don't know, whatever they do to get real healthy. They live it up like a resort. And the prison camp was built up near the top of the town was down below, but this was up on top of the mountain or the hill nearby. So they lined us all up to march up the long winding road up to the prison camp on the top, at the top of the hill. And the one thing we found out is that since we were now deep in Germany, by the way, I neglected to say further back, I was looking out of the boxcar and I could see us crossing over a river, a lot of water, but then when I didn't know where it was, but then I did see a sign, a train station we went through said Frankfurt and Hanau. So I knew that was probably the Rhine we had crossed in this train, and now we were truly in Germany and heading north. Well, anyway, walking up this hill, we took a look at the guards that they had. Apparently they were impressed citizens or maybe old World War I retirees or something like that. But I think all the guards were probably at the very least, 75 or 80 years old or older. They were extremely ill. Some of them, I'll swear, looked like my grandfather did when he was 90. They could just barely walk. They were carrying heavy packs. They had long rifles that probably went back to the late 1800s. And they were having real trouble trying to keep up. They had frequent breaks about every 15 minutes or so. They would call a halt, and these poor old fellows that were the guards, they'd be panting and puffing and all out of breath and just about able to stagger along, and then we'd start up again. Well, about halfway up the hill, I guess maybe because we are Americans, there is a little bit of difference. One of the fellows reached out to the old gentleman that was next to him and tapped him on the back and pointed to his backpack, and sort of lifted and pulled it, and the fellow looked around and nodded like that. So he picked the old gentleman's backpack, stuck it on his own shoulder, and we had his pack. And a couple of the other fellows on the other end with older men saw the same thing, and we did it and got away with it, so they helped their old guards with carrying their packs. Well, a little further on up the hill at another break, the old gentleman, even though he didn't have his backpack, he was panting and puffing, and he looked like he was ready to collapse, and he wound up down on his knees, in fact, trying to get his breath back. So when they called to start again, while we reached out, took his rifle from his shoulder, he didn't even object, handed that to another GI. So now we're carrying his rifle and we're carrying his backpack, and a little further on, we pull the old gentleman in between us and two GIs, one under each arm, and we're practically half carrying the poor guy up the hill. And some of the other fellows in other places we can see were doing the same thing with their guards. Well, as we approached near the top of the hill, they called another break, and apparently the German officer in charge wanted to check up to be sure that everything was looking nice. And before we actually came to a stop, he was walking down looking, and you could see his jaw drop. His guards, maybe half his guards are being half carried by GIs who also are carrying their rifles and their packs. And he called a stop right then. He said, "You can't do it this way. We can't go into a camp like this." Yeah, but we were excusing the old fellows. I mean, they can't do it. He said, "We can't do it. When we get to the top of the hill, give them back their pack and their rifles and everything, and it's level. They can get in." So when we got to the next break, they called a halt, and we put the packs back on the fellows and fixed them up. By that, they were a little bit rested then, and the road was level. It wasn't a steep hill anymore. So they got very military, and they straightened up as best as they could, and so we marched in real nice, in step, real American military, that sort of thing. But apparently the word got around, I guess, at their lunch group, whatever it is. But you know what? These Americans really aren't such bad people. I mean, you know, I don't know. I'm imagining this. That's my own interpretation. But anyway, we received fairly good treatment in there. That time we were still getting a little better food. We got, you know, soup, and you could make a little bit of meat once in a while every day and that sort of thing. So we were all still losing weight. Well, we stayed at Bad Orb, which is Stalag 9B. By the way, the report here just has the two reverse. It has a 9A and a 9B. 9A and 9B exist, but we went to 9B at Bad Orb, and we went to 9A at the next place, Ziegenhain. To get to Ziegenhain, we couldn't ride a train. We had to ride in trucks. That was an interesting situation too, apparently. The Germans would use any kind of trucks they could get, like I said before, and but not all of them worked properly, so they would use one truck that worked as a tractor for another truck that didn't work. They'd chain it together or cable in some way. So one truck would go along loaded with whoever was in it, and the next truck was just being towed along very much behind it. So we finally got on those and finally wound up at the second camp, Stalag 9A, which was at Ziegenhain. And the bunks in there were three decks high, about so high to the top one. And as we went in, they issued us our POW numbers. This is the German dog tags that they put on you, so that it has a number on it, and I guess that's your serial, your military POW serial number, and it says 9B on it, and you had to put this on, and this was your identification while you were a POW. They're made out of zinc, apparently. At least they're not magnetic that I can see. So we had that on, and every morning then, of course, we had to have a roll call, the usual stuff. They checked it. But they took us on a tour through the camp, or through the barracks. The barracks we were in, they pointed out that it had one stove in the middle, and they gave little sticks and things. That was a little bit, and that was supposed to keep you warm. Well, a barracks twice the size of this room down here, one little cast iron stove isn't going to keep you very warm. But they did provide sticks every now and then, whatever brush they were cleaning up. And then they showed us in the bunks. Every bunk had exactly 8 slats. They were about 3 inches wide, 3 to 4 inches wide, and they ran on 2 rails right across. across it, and you slept on those. The only problem was, with only 8 slats, there was a lot of unsupported space in between. So you looked like a suspension bridge, I suppose, sagging down between all the slats. And you were issued 1 blanket apiece, 1 thin, skinny blanket, and told you had to sleep 2 to a bunk. So you picked a buddy that you didn't mind being close to, and you had to be synchronized, you know, both to the left, right, and then in the middle of the night you switched right to the left, and then left to the right. And it was cozy, but we handled that pretty well. And then they issued us their food. And they pointed out, they said, you know, things in Germany now, we have a little problem, and the troops get most of the food, so we'll give you as much as we can. As much as they could give us was, for breakfast, 1 cup of hot tea. Now, the tea you have to put in quotes. It was hot and it was brown, but we never did figure out what the flavor was. People said, some said it was roasted barley, some said it was roasted acorns and ground up. We don't know, but that was breakfast. At lunchtime, you got a cup of soup, and the soup was mostly water. It had some potatoes in it, had a little bit of cabbage, and sometimes you got a little barley or something, you didn't know what. And you got protein in the form of maggots, that sort of thing. And it also had something rather unique at the time, we thought. Each cup of soup had a lot of pine needles in it, just floating around. Well, you look at them, most of the fellows, you can't eat them, so you took them out and that sort of thing, got rid of them. There was actually an active exchange going on. People, some of the fellows insisted on having your maggots, because to be realistic, it was protein. And I never got quite that hungry, although I probably ate plenty of them without knowing it. So there were other problems involved in, to make it delicate, going to the bathroom. We found out that by eating this diet, your weight got steadily lower and lower, and as a result, you didn't have to go to the bathroom very often. In fact, once every 10 days or 2 weeks was satisfactory enough, because the food you ate, the little bit you had, apparently the body worked on so intensively that there was nothing left, nothing to excrete. But you did have to go eventually, and the problem then was toilet paper. Now, a lot of GIs and fellows who are in the Army, I know, you either had a squashed up roll, partial roll of toilet paper, or you took paper and packed it together and stuck it in your helmet between the helmet liner and the webbing on the top. It was always convenient in there. But when that was gone, there wasn't any more. So we put in our little complaint to the German commandant, and he said, we will take care of that. We understand the problem. He was a very nice guy, actually. And they found out that all the German troops in the area get leave, just as ours did, and they also receive passes to go to town, whatever it happened to be. And the passes were written on little pieces of paper about that size, I guess. Unfortunately, it was shiny paper, you know, it wasn't absorbent or anything else. So they saved all those things. They didn't throw anything away, anything that had a possible use. So every week there was toilet paper issuance day. And that's one of the fun things that even we enjoyed the humor. First came a private, German private, with a little express wagon, the kind the kids used to have and pull along, you know, with people on like that. That was full of these used passes in there. Then along came a corporal who had did the actual issuance. All the other fellow did was pull the wagon. The corporal actually issued the toilet paper. A sergeant was there with them, and his job was to check your number, your name, and the list, and if it all added up properly, you were issued your 2 sheets of toilet paper. And then, of course, a German officer came along to be sure the whole operation was running properly. And you had this whole train going down the line at roll call and going through this very meticulous routine of toilet paper issuance. And the commandant, by the way, of the camp, had a very nice little dog that always walked with him. And he was well trained, he always healed at the right stuff. And instead of everybody appreciating the dog, how well trained he was, everyone that looked at him kept thinking, you know what, I'll bet he would taste good. Look at the muscles on that leg, you know, boy, if we only could get hold of him, we'd have some real meat. But of course we never did it. But later on then, on one of the inspections, oh, by the way, we did get showers. Every 2 weeks we got a hot shower. But even that was rather apprehensive at the time. We had heard of these concentration camps where they took the poor people in and they had shower heads up there, but no water came out of the shower heads. They opened the valve and out came the poison gas and that sort of stuff. So when they said, we're going to take a shower, you get a little apprehensive, especially when you go into this big room and all it has is shower heads all over the top and bars on the windows, and you keep thinking, how do I get out of this place if what I think is going to happen could happen? But the big surprise was they opened the valve and out came hot water. But they announced, you have 10 minutes for everything. So you get in there, you gave it a little cake of soap about the size of a golf ball, only about half the size. Real brown soap. So you went in there quick and you sloshed off real good, quickly as you could, and you stayed under the shower, and then they blew the whistle 1 minute, you know, that sort of thing. And if you didn't get the lather off by the last whistle, you're really sticky for the rest of the next 2 weeks or so. But at the same time, they also deloused our uniforms. And of course, you took everything off to get the shower naturally, and they just took a rope and ran it through the sleeves of your coats and your pants legs and anything to hold it together, tied a knot in the end. They threw it in some kind of a cart, took it out, and we understand, I never saw it, to some room where the temperature was extremely high, almost boiling, and that was supposed to kill all the lice and everything else. You had to shower, so therefore you're pure and clean, no problem. Then when it came back, you had the big fuss of looking around. What we finally did was to take our dog tags here and hang them on in the pants pocket or on the shirt pocket or something so we could identify our own clothing and put it back on again. There was one interesting episode then at one of the interrogations. The interrogator went through all the stuff we had to be sure. It was a real thorough interrogation. They wanted all kind of questions. They went through all your uniform, be sure you weren't hiding grenades and guns and all that sort of thing. And they went through our packs and everything we had. Well, I happened to have, I thought, well, it's, you know, I shouldn't have a camera, but I did have a camera. So the guard standing behind took everything out and laid it on a table though, so the interrogator could look at it. Well, all the military stuff was automatically taken. If you had a GI type watch that was issued by the military, that automatically went. Anything, if you had any equipment, whatever, that was U.S. military, they took. So I thought, well, there goes the end of everything we have. So the watch that I had was a civilian watch given to me. So the guard looked at that and took it off, put it down there. And looked at it. That's not a military watch. I said, no, I got it from my father. So he hands it back to me. So when he got to the camera, he looked at that, he says, got good pictures? I said, there's no pictures on this. I didn't even get with your guys chasing after me, I didn't get a chance to take any pictures. So he said, take the film out. So I took the film out and handed it to him. Then he put it in a little box there. And I said, and I guess you want this? I handed him the camera. He said, that's not military, that's yours. And he hands it back to me. Of course, I wasn't going to get any film for it anyway, so that took care of that. Then he went through the books that I had, and it was rather fascinating. And I found this out later on when we were in that barn. The fellow there looked. I had a textbook on radio engineering, because that happened to be my business, my field. And I had a good book on mathematics. I thought, knowing a little bit about the military, I thought I'm going to have a lot of time to read on these things, and maybe I'll come out of the service smarter than I went in. Well, he looked at all those books, and I had a Bible, and I had found out that these other fellers, a lot of the Germans carried Bibles, which surprised me, including the SS men. They were, you got one? Yeah. here's mine. So again, surprises all the time. But anyway, when we went to this book to the interrogator, he handed back my mathematics book. That's fine. And he handed back my the Bible, of course, all right. When he got the engineering book, electrical engineering, he said, "We keep this." I said, why you keep that? I said, he says, "We want the information." He said, I said, "This is just a school text. Any college in the United States uses this one. It's a standard one." He said, "Well, we might learn something that's a little different." So then that's when I got the smart, I was going to say something else. But, but anyway, I said, "Look, if you fellows don't know what's in this book, this is only a basic text, I said, then you guys aren't as smart as you try to be." So I expected, uh-oh, I shouldn't have said that. Instead, he laughed at me. He said, "I know what you mean, but we'll still keep it, just in case." So he kept somewhere in Germany, there's a copy of Terman's Radio Engineering floating around, I guess. Maybe it's in their museum. But back again to the prison camp then, everything was working fine there, except one day, planes came over and strafed the camp, of all things. And the excuse given, of course, the commandant, the strafed over incident, we had about, at least I know, about 7 or 8 casualties in our barracks. And we couldn't figure out why American planes would strafe a German prison camp for POWs. The commandant took a group of, we had, by the way, we had selected about a group of about 6 master sergeants, tech sergeants, and so on, and a couple of fellows that could speak German to interpret, and they acted as our liaison with the camp commandant. And the camp, we protested there. Now, what can we do? The camp commandant said he's already sent a message to the Swiss representative asking them or protesting what they actually did of strafing a prison camp. And I think a day or so later, it came back from Switzerland that one of the guards had opened fire on the plane that was flying around the outside the camp, and maybe wasn't sure it was a prison camp. So immediately after the strafing had happened, by the way, the commandant took our committee group up on the roof and left us examine all the guns in the tower. He said, "This has happened before," and he said he wants you to show exactly nobody fired from this camp at the plane. And sure enough, all the guns were clean, and they didn't have time to do anything about it. No holes in the guard towers or anything of that sort. So then I think the call came back from Switzerland again, saying, well, one guard must have used a pistol or something and fired at somebody. And of course, our question was then, if he did want to strafe that one tower, why did he come in from outside so that everything went past the tower into the barracks of the camp? If he wanted to do it the other way, that might have been different. Everything that missed would have at least gone outside the place. But of course, it was never finally settled. Well, later on, one of the fascinating things that was rather interesting, I want to be sure I don't keep you people too late, when the weather began to get a little bit nicer, we were allowed outside into the area outside the barracks. And except you weren't allowed to get inside of a wire inside the place. That was a shooting offense. If you touched that wire, you were dead. At least that's the way what they said they would do. Actually, a couple of times, some of the fellows were actually out there leaning against the fence, taking a nap, and the guard would come over and poke them with a rifle, point back in again. So there was no nastiness of any sort like that. But whenever any planes came over, of course, automatically we were all shooed inside the barracks. For some reason, they did not want us out visible to any reconnaissance planes that were flying around. They came over periodically, maybe once a week. They would just fly around the outside and then take off somewhere. But as soon as they showed up anywhere at all, we immediately had to go in the barracks, and we couldn't see what went on outside. But after the plane went away, then we were allowed to come out. Well, there was one road, a small country road, that in going apparently to Ziegenhain came from outside the country, and it happened to go right past the outside of the fence of the American compound. And I say the American compound because there were other compounds in this prison camp. There was one for the French who had been there since the fall of France. And when France was conquered, why they put all the French in there. And then there was another one with all the British. British were captured at Dieppe and all those places, and they're part of their force. There was a British compound. There was another compound, I think, for a small one for members of the Polish army that were also captured and put in there. And then there was a very big compound on the other side where we couldn't see it. It was Russian prisoners. And we understand there was about 500 or 600 Americans altogether, as far as we could estimate. And I don't know how many British. There's a lot of French there. And, but several thousand Russians. So they didn't knock all the Russians off. They put them in the prison camp. I guess they were feeding them too. Maybe not as much. I don't know. But in any case, we found out about the Russians all later on. Well, there were, outside this little road that went past the American compound there was two young girls who used to ride bicycles past every day. Apparently they lived somewhere out in the country and probably went to Ziegenhain, had a job of some kind in there. And they would just ride past, and since we're GIs and we like girls, well, you know, they'd wave at us, all that, you know, big smile, and we'd wave back and that sort of thing, and every day. And then finally about a week later, when they were coming past, they had baskets on the front. They pulled the cover off the basket and picked up, it had apples in there. And they'd fling an apple over the fence into our compound. And hey, this is nice, two girls throwing apples in here. So what we did was wait until the guard would look in some other direction and, you know, not around. Then we go out and very carefully reach down and pick up an apple, stick it in our pocket, and go back into the barracks. And you could use a tin can or whatever you had for a knife, and you could slice all pieces of apple. Well, one apple between about 15 or 20 guys, you know, you got a taste maybe, but that's about all. But finally, we kept thinking, these girls are going to get into trouble. I mean, they started doing this regularly. Every time they went past, they would fling, they had maybe a half a dozen apples or so in the basket, and each one would fling a couple of apples over. And when the guard wasn't looking, and we'd very shyly pick them up and take them away. So finally we noticed that the guard used to also wave at the girls all the time too. And we finally figured out he wasn't stupid. We noticed when the girls came down, when they're far away, he'd wave at them, they'd wave back. And then the guard with his rifle would walk over and look over and check on something else and see how it's doing. And after the apples came over, then he'd look around and everything looks just fine, no problem and everything else. So he was in on the deal himself. And it became a regular episode. We liked it, we enjoyed it, we waved at the girls, we got the apples and everything else. And the guard, as I say, he always managed to look in another direction when the apples were coming over the fence. Well, one day, I mean, this went on for almost a month, I guess, 3 weeks or so. And one day while we're out there, suddenly a plane comes overhead, and we get the usual shout, you know, the whistle blows or siren, whatever the heck they had, into the barracks. So we all crowd into the barracks, and we could hear the plane buzzing around on the outside. And then finally we could hear the engine increase in power like he's going to go into a dive. And we heard him machine gun and said, boy, you got a target out there somewhere. We found out later our little apple girls were dead. So from that point on, every now and then, the planes would do it again, and the Germans would take a couple of their Messerschmitts and they'd go up after the planes. And when they went after them, we always cheered the Messerschmitts. they were the heroes, and every now and then they'd win one, and we'd still see the smoke coming up in the distance, and the Messerschmitt would be coming back, so we knew who got hit that time and went down. But from that point on, ever since they got our two young girls, why, we cheered the Messerschmitts. But finally, we could hear artillery in the distance coming closer, and day by day it was all closer. It was obvious the American lines were moving in, and we didn't know then, but the Russians were coming in from the other way, of course. We didn't get reports like that. And the usual procedure every time was to always keep, you didn't want, no side wanted the enemy to get their own prisoners back. They put them back in the army again, now they had a bigger army. So every time, as we went to Bad Orb first, they moved us out of there into Ziegenhain because the Americans were getting closer. Well, now they were getting close to Ziegenhain, and the standard procedure would be to take us out and move us to another prison camp somewhere, but Germany was getting squeezed down with the Russians coming in and the Patton, so on, coming up the other way. So one day we got the order to get all your gear together, whatever you have, pack it all together because we're going to be moving out tomorrow. And, well, you know, where to now? The apprehension now builds up again. So we got all the stuff together that we were going to take, and, you know, you save cans. When you got an occasional Red Cross package, you very carefully cut the lid out. Now you had an extra cup to put something in or keep something. So we got all set up to go, and they divided the Americans into two groups. Or they had moved in a regular German combat division, not division, but combat company into that area. And they were going to guard us while we went to wherever we were going to go next. About half of the troops, the Americans, were taken out, and the guards went around them, and they started out down the road, and, you know, to who knows what and where. And about an hour later, suddenly, they're all coming back. The same POWs back into the place, the same guards. And the commandant then explained that they had changed their orders. That and the German military commander of the German combat company that was there was also there too. The others could speak better, the commandant could speak better English. He explained that the German government decided that there was no point in moving prisoners continuously like that, and which then you went down and you think, uh-oh, now what does this mean? Because we had had the rumors that Hitler had ordered that at this time now, all prisoners would be executed. You know, you don't leave any live prisoners behind. This is it. So, of course, that's the first thing we thought of. But the commandant said, however, we have a proposal to make to you. And, yeah, what's this? He said, the German government, or the army, wants these troops to go east to the front where the Russians are coming in, which means they don't want to use combat troops as POW guards. So they said, we will make a deal with you if you agree to it. We will stay here, you can stay here, we'll leave you behind all by yourself. You'll have access to whatever food is provided around here. You can help yourself that way, but you must stay in the camp. Do not go out of the camp under any circumstances. Not only because it's good military practice, but we might have some troops around here, and if you're caught outside, well, you're in big trouble. So he said, we've already discussed this with the French and with the British, and they agree that they will go by that. You're the only ones that we haven't asked. So we said, well, of course, you know, sure, we'd be very happy to stay here until we're liberated. So then the commandant said, or the German military commander of the company said, and we have one more request that you must agree to for us to do this. He said, we have over a couple of thousand Russians in here, and we said, the British, the French, and you have agreed you will stay within the confines of the camp. The Russians we're not sure about, and we don't want them getting loot. So he said, what we propose to do is for you Americans, only the Americans, said, to give us your word that you will provide guards to keep the Russians from getting out, keep them in their compound. So, of course, we said, that sounds like a good idea, except there's a couple thousand of the Russians there, and there's about 500 of us. How are we going to keep the Russians in? They said, we were waiting for you to ask that question. We are going to give you guns and ammunition, and if you agree to do this, we'll have you armed, and you can do what we said, if you agree to it. Obviously, we agreed to it. I mean, what could be better for us? So the German troops actually gave us rifles, and in fact, they were guns that we were used to. They had captured American M1s, so we knew all about them. So they gave us, I guess, maybe about 8 or 10 rifles, and ammunition, clips, and all that sort of thing. And They shook hands all around, very good, thank you, we appreciate it, we wish you well. Said, you at least are going to go home, and we're going east, and we don't know where we're going to wind up. So we wish you the best of everything, and we left on a real friendly basis with the Nazis, and they marched on, and you know, I don't have no idea whatever happened to them, or what. I can guess, make guesses, I guess. So anyway, we set up a duty roster, we assigned rotating lists for guards and everything else. We went outside the the Russian compound and set up posts out there, checked the fences and that sort of thing, and decided we had things under control. The next day, we get a contingent from the Russian group coming over to our representatives, and they were furious too about, what do you Americans mean by making a deal with the Nazis to guard us, and we're your allies, all that sort of stuff. Oh, they were really all frazzled up, and they insisted that they had to be included. So it got a little testy for a while, and the fellows that had the rifles, well, they kind of very casually held them, you know, relaxed like this, pointing in the right direction, and convinced them to go back to their compound. So they did. The next day, they were back again with a new approach. They said, you Americans, all you do is talk about democracy. All you do is talk about free elections, where the majority wins. Well, we're all allies, and since there's so many of us, and not so many of you, you're outvoted, so now if you'll please give us the rifles, we'll take over the camp. Well, then it got really testy, and I understand there was a little bit of shooting going on there, and the Russians finally went back to their compound. So we waited there, and we posted our guards. A couple of days later, some of the Russians did get out past our guards. They dug under the fence or something, and they did, maybe about 6 of them, I think, got into the town of Ziegenhain nearby, and they did exactly what the Germans were afraid of. They started abusing the residents that were just ordinary civilians, farmers and things living in there. They started abusing them. They were beating up old people, and we heard there was a couple of rape cases, and we heard that later on. But as soon as we found out that they got out, we set up a patrol of our own, armed patrol, centered into Ziegenhain, rounded these characters up, and took them back. And we locked them in a special place that was provided for them and kept them out of there. So anyway, we stayed there until finally one day a tank came up, and this one had a star on it. It came rolling up, and it was one of Patton's advanced patrols. And he parked outside the fence and looked at him there, and then we had a good talk with him. So they cleaned out any food that was in the tank, or any kind of ration. They drove in, opened the gate, drove in, dumped all the stuff there that they had, and told us just to hang in there, that they wouldn't be here for a while. So apparently the battle was still going on. This was some kind of an advanced group, and they went back. So we stayed in the camp for probably another almost 2 weeks, 10 days or 2 weeks, and finally, at that time, we kid about it very much. One of the jokes, that we were in a prison camp where we had nothing but French cooking with French chefs, because the French did all the cooking for the entire camp. They ran these great big pots to make the soup in, with heating them with logs. They were tremendous big things. Pressure cookers, by the way. They had a lid that went down with a chain hoist, and they bolted the darn thing down, so it was good cooking. And of course, this time they could make all the food they wanted, all the things that were in the warehouses. The beans, anything that was there, you could have. They found sugar, we got cheese, all kind of stuff like that. And we lived it up really well. And finally, in all due time, the first American tanks and troops and armored equipment came up, and they surrounded the camp, went in, they looked at us. They brought a bunch of German prisoners in there at that time to take our place. They were mostly young kids, like about 12 to 15 in that bracket. They were scared to death, and they shushed them in, and it was a reverse condition. They were living in with us because we hadn't been able to get out yet. They just dumped them in with us, and at first the Americans did not treat the young German kids as well as they had treated us. They got more food and everything else, but they made them sleep on the floor, and they wouldn't let them in the bunks. And finally, some of the other GIs that were in there didn't like the treatment. I mean, the poor kids, they were impressed in the service. They had nothing to do about it. They were just plain drafted. So they finally got through to some of the more nasty type Americans that wanted to really beat them up and everything else. Said, look, these kids, you guys, all of us, we're all going to go home. We know that. When the Army gets here, we go. We got a home to go to. I said, these kids probably may not even have parents. They may not even have homes or anything to live in. You don't know what their future is. So finally, more or less, why they started treating them a little more decently. And in all due time, when the tanks came up, they brought a whole convoy of trucks, loaded us in the trucks, drove us from Ziegenhain or from Stalag 9A to Gießen, in a little further north in Germany. There was an airport. They loaded us on what used to be DC-3s. I think they're C-47s now, I'm not sure. And they flew us into Le Havre. And in Le Havre, they were prepared for us. They had a big field open there, all set up with tents, showers, the whole works, everything you needed for comfortable living. And in the middle of this whole area was another big tent, and at the assembly, they explained to us that tent is a food tent. Now, anytime you get hungry for anything at all, any one of you in the tents there, all you have to do, 24 hours a day, go down to that tent, tell them what you want, and if we have it, you're going to get it. You want a steak? Good. With mushrooms? Good. Tell them what you want, how big you want it, and the chefs down there will cook it up for you. Well, a lot of the fellows took advantage of that, and others didn't, and they suddenly realized, you know, this is for real. We can really eat now. And it sounded great, and they did a wonderful job there. We had one fellow, however, and this is something that sort of gets through to me now every time I pass a Dunkin' Donuts. His big hang-up was to have donuts, lots of donuts. In the prison camp, by the way, we constantly thought of food. That was the biggest thing on your mind, was food. One of the tricks we used to pull is try to get a subject of talking about what the military likes, women and girls, you know, Betty Grable and movie stars and all that sort of thing. The object was to see how long you could get them talking about women before it segued into food. For example, you know, talking about, you know, Betty Grable, she's beautiful and everything else. Yeah, I wonder if she can cook. I mean, that's the first thing that came out, you know. You couldn't keep on any subject except food. And, we used to have cooking classes, by the way. Nothing to cook, but we had fellows that had Greek background, Italian, German, French, anything you want. And every day we'd have a cooking class where one of these, who maybe they worked in a restaurant or were chefs or something, and they'd get the big blackboard from the commandant and they'd talk about, write recipes down. Now when I used to make this, and that's where I learned about pizza, by the way, where I came from upstate Pennsylvania. They didn't even know about pizza. But I learned all about pizza and how to make good pizza by going to these cooking classes in a POW camp. But anyway, this one fellow, his big hang-up was donuts. And all he said when he got home, he was going to go to a donut place and just buy all the donuts in the place and eat them all. So when he went to this big mess tent, he put in his order. He said, I want donuts and a pot of coffee. So they did. They gave him a big pot of coffee and a big plate with a couple of dozen donuts on the darn thing. And then his buddies were there, and he said, I'm going to eat every one of these donuts. Well, I think he got to about 16 or 20, something like that, and he collapsed. So they hauled him off to the medical facility there, and the next day he was dead. And they attributed the whole thing to the fact that we were so used to no food that his system just couldn't handle it, and it actually killed him. Now, I had been eating food in this tent now for about 2 weeks, good food. And when I got my medical examination, I was all the way up to 97 pounds. So it gives you a feeling. I think I would have been a good consort for Ally McBeal, but she was relatively fat compared to us. But in any case, from that point on, we went back to Le Havre. They gave us a quick train trip to Paris, which I had never been to before, of course. It was beautiful, friendly. The people were nice. We learned to ride the metro. we couldn't pay a penny for anything. They did give us an advance on our pay, so we had to buy anything. But everywhere we wanted to go, the doors were wide open. And at that time, it was in April, I think it was lilac time. And on the metro, most of the women were all taking bunches of lilacs home. And each time we got on one of the cars, they would all hand us a bunch of lilacs. Each time we got off of the train, we had our arms full of lilacs. It smelled wonderful, and it was wonderful. And a couple of weeks after that, they put us on another troop ship in a convoy and sent us back to USA. And then they eventually, I got me a POW medal now, all for my very own. It proves that I was really there. But it all ended well. Thank you. Oh, I got unhooked. Gee, this is being restrained again. If there's any questions, why, I might be able to answer them.
What year was that when you were in the camp?
Not the one that's in here. This is different. This says I was, 1945. But
It'd be good to keep this. So,
oh yeah, I forgot about that. I'm still talking. Okay. What was the question? What year was that? That was near the end. This was the same time as the bulge was going on in Northern Europe there, and I guess we were a sort of a fringe area.
Besides the train being marked for prisoners of war, were the barracks you stayed in that you said were shot
In the
at,
prison camp?
Red Crosses on them or anything like that?
No Red Cross, loud and clear, KG, KG, great big letters, you spread all over the blooming place. You couldn't miss it.
In the barracks too?
On the barracks, yes. The whole barracks roof had this big, everyone had KG on it. And another reason they said that they strafed the train, even though it was marked KG, I read somewhere, someone said that the Germans used to take a prisoner of war train and then put a couple of ammunition trains in the car, supposedly, that they thought, well, nobody would bother them. This way they could move ammunition in the daylight. But we didn't have anything like that on ours. I mean, it was strictly all KG boxcars all the way along. But it was a fascinating, interesting experience. There's a lot of other little nifties that occurred at the same time. But since you people have to go home, what is it? 20 after 8. Gosh.
9:15.
8:45. I'm looking at the second hand. Okay then.
fine, thank you very much.
Okay.
Another good talk.
Thank you. All right, I'll unhook.
I'll leave your dog tags on you.
Yeah.
Okay, another good story. There's a lot of more good stories out there. I had one signed up today. Anybody was in the Pacific in the Air Force, we've got a B-24 guy from, I forget, the 90th Bomber Group or something. And he's going to be talking, it'll probably be next August when we get to him. And I was going to ask, are there others? I know there's Don Lewis in the group that was in the POW camp. How many other in the audience were in POW camps? Craig Scholler? Well, I thought maybe we'd have a few more there. Fortunately, you didn't get there. It wasn't fun, I'm sure, but there was fun even where there was no fun. If there are other people who have stories to tell, think about giving them to us to tell. If you don't want to stand up and tell your stories, think about writing your stories and we can put them on the internet for you. Our website has almost unlimited space available to us. I've tried to find out what the limit was that we could put on our site, and they don't seem to know of any limit. So we could put a story on for everybody in the audience. Yes? Well, we have a website and we have signed permission with the details of how it's used.
How about the writers?
The writers, If there is someone with copyrighted material, we have to have their permission to put it on the site. If someone in the group wants to write a story and give it to us, preferably in computer files is the way we can handle it best. But if you write it out in longhand and give it to us, we'll get it typed and put your story on the internet. Our site is listed in our notes here. Item 5 is, and Greg Tarda, you're not here. Okay. I thought maybe he's our webmaster, I guess is the right word for it. And you can either get the material to me, or I can give you his email address and you can send it to him. And you'll be on the internet. You can tell your friends to log on and read your story. So I guess anybody else have any comments or observations, or take a minute or two? Jack?
Yeah, just to show you what this is all about, I've known Win since the 50s. I was president of the gun club, he was my vice president. We never talked about this. He never heard my story until I got up here, and I never heard his story until tonight. But this is what it's all about. We were so quiet for so long. Now this is being about what's going on.
So I guess I'll end the message tonight with a reminder again that the library is putting together the video system that I initially tried to get them to put together, exactly what we wanted. And it'd be nice if we could find some people in the audience that have discretionary money available that would like to make a tax-deductible donation. Should be in checks made out to the library with a note in the memo area, a World War II lecture series, so they know that it came from our group. The other thing I'd call to your attention is that the Holy Trinity has not charged us for the use of the facility. There's a basket out there for the Parish Relief Fund. I'd appreciate it if some of you could see your way clear to put a few bucks in the Parish Relief Fund. The pastors use the fund to provide funding for services for people who have need it. Okay, that's it. See you next month. What's this? Okay. One other item that I didn't know about, or didn't remember about, is something to do with the Purple Heart Medal, and I want Jack to tell you about it. Just hold it up close.
We have a Purple Heart chapter that meets in